Hey everyone, welcome to #Malkin Live. I've got another packed show for you today. And because we've added Facebook to the live stream, I'm just kind of going to vamp here for maybe half a minute and let people trickle in water cooler style. We're live streaming on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter for now. As many of you might have noticed, I posted a warning that I got on my Facebook page that I'm in danger of having that page unpublished for unspecified violations of community standards. But of course, they're always unspecified. That's how the game is played. I had an incredible night last night that I'll tell you more about at the tail end of our show. But we're going to be talking about the dire effects of the COVID lockdowns and a groundbreaking study that was done by Revolver News that analyzes it in a way that it hasn't yet been analyzed before. And we'll talk about the nuts and bolts of that. But I wanted to open up with playing you a couple of videos, one that went viral overnight, a scene out of Melbourne, Australia that Hollywood simply could not conjure up. And like I said, I'm just sort of slowly letting people trickle in. And I see lots of people from the comment section. Hi, everybody. Hi, Facebook commenters. Thanks for joining me. And I will talk about Kyle Rittenhouse, latest with Lynn Wood and his battle with the Twitter censors, as well as the legal efforts there as well. But today is focused on the COVID lockdowns and the deadly, I mean, literally deadly impact of them. First thing I'm going to do is share a screen with you. This, as I mentioned, is from Melbourne. I saw it on Rita Panahi's feed, but it's everywhere now. Just take a look.
Yeah, you can show me your search warrant before you go through my house.
Search warrant.
Search warrant for what?
Now, if you want to listen, you got your phone going?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Right. Now, you're under arrest in relation to incitement.
Incitement?
Yeah. Now, you're not obliged to say or do anything, but anything you say or do may be given evidence.
Excuse me, incitement for what? What on earth? Excuse me, what on earth?
Just put your phone down.
Can you, record this? I'm in my pajamas.
What's this?
I had an ultrasound in an hour.
Yeah, she's pregnant, so... What's this about?
I have an ultrasound
Just let me finish.
in an hour.
Let me finish and I'll explain. It's in relation to a Facebook post, in relation to a lockdown protest you put on the Saturday.
Yeah, and I wasn't breaking any laws by doing that.
You are breaking the law. That's why I'm arresting you in relation to this.
How can you arrest her?
In front
That's...
of my 2 children.
Can't you just say to her, take the post down? Like, come on.
I'm happy to delete the post. This is ridiculous.
Yeah.
I have to give you these cautionary rights. You understand?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm happy to delete the post. This is ridiculous. This is in front of me. That's
maybe
fine.
giving evidence. You understand that?
Yeah, that's fine. But my 2 kids are here. I have an ultrasound in an hour. I'm happy to delete the post.
You also have the right to communicate with or to communicate with a legal practitioner. You understand those rights?
Yeah, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, this is a bit unfair. Come on, mate.
No.
What about she just doesn't do the event? Like, it's not like she's done it.
It just makes my blood boil. How many of you feel the same way? This is a narco-tyranny. This is the dystopia that we live in. A pregnant mom arrested in front of her husband and children for communicating details about an anti-lockdown protest that she was involved in. No other means of appealing it, no way to take down the post in order to avoid arrest. And we'll try to find out what exactly is happening with her now, what her status is, whether she has a lawyer, and I'll update you. People are outraged about this, but people also have very short memories. And it's not like this is some remote thing that's happening overseas in Australia. You all remember the Texas salon owner who was carted away in handcuffs before Greg Abbott had to intervene. And another bar owner in Texas as well. And I just want to refresh your memories on that as well. I think it's definitely worth taking the time because we live in such an ADD world. People forget these things are happening every single freaking day.
Your own interests ahead of those of the community in which you live. But they disrespected the executive orders of the state, the orders of the county, the city. Get back!
All right, you remember that? And there's one other one I wanted to share as well, because it's near and dear to my heart in my old neck of the woods where I grew up in South Jersey. A lot of you will remember what happened in Belmar to the owners of the Attila's Gym. And this was back in May.
Arresting the citizen here. What are you doing? That's bullshit. Why are you arresting him? Criminals are in jail, and a man who does not exercise is being arrested.
All right, that's bullshit. I agree with that, Heckler. With that, I'm bringing in Darren Beatty, political theorist. Hey, Darren.
Hi.
How's your blood pressure level right now?
It's very emotionally charged content.
It is, and so we're going to marry those scenes to some meat and some flesh on the bones that you've put on this point that you've been making on your Twitter feed and your commentary about just how unprecedented and how catastrophic these global lockdowns have been on people. Tell us about the new study that just came out that's been covered widely everywhere now. I saw Tucker mention it and Matt Gaetz, and it's all over the internet. What do people need to know about this study?
Well, before I get into the study, I would like to say that, and this is just my own opinion, editorialization, but I think that these COVID lockdowns amount to perhaps the greatest crime against humanity other than war and genocide. It is a criminal act of such proportions that I think the general population isn't even prepared psychologically to digest the full implications of what's going on. A great financial analyst described it as the greatest and fastest roll-up of power in history. And that's precisely what it is. It's a great crime in my view, but the most generous interpretation is an act, it's a policy measure of absolute criminal incompetence. And this is where we get to the study that doesn't speculate in the more ominous directions that I think are certainly plausible, but it does get into what a enormous blunder this was from a public policy perspective. And there are multiple dimensions of the study, so feel free to stop me at any time and ask me to elaborate. But the gist of it is simply, it's actually quite simple. The study itself, although some of the formulations and the numbers can seem complicated, the core of it is very simple. It looks at the fact that, okay, yes, we have these lockdowns that presumably have saved some people from COVID death. I think even that is a little bit controversial, but the study conservatively assumes that the lockdowns have prevented some people from dying of COVID. But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story has to weigh the costs as well as the benefits. And this is just one general point that's so crucial for your viewers and really everyone in the country who's affected by this needs to understand, is that you cannot disaggregate economics from public health. You cannot disaggregate economics from public health. So any kind of like morally supercilious attitude that these so-called public health experts have, where they say, oh, you're just worried about the economy, this is about protecting grandma. Totally false and deceptive formulation. You cannot disaggregate the economy from public health. And this study really drives that point home. It looks at pre-existing literature in the economics field, establishing very clear relationships between a percentage increase in unemployment and measurable health effects, and the effect on people entering into the job market, going into the economy in an era of recession, which is what we're in, and we're facing the kinds of unemployment levels that we haven't seen since the Great Depression as a result of these lockdowns. When I say economics cannot be disaggregated from public health, that's to say that people's livelihoods cannot be separated from their lives. It's not mere property. It's not mere job. People who lose their jobs can become depressed. They can get addicted to drugs. There's so many people in this world who are just at that point, just over the line. And when they are pushed on the other side, they enter into a downward spiral in life that can ultimately lead to death or a lower life expectancy. And the study that we're talking about at revolver.news really just puts a fine point on it. And so moving to the next kind of, I think, interesting thing to understand about this.
Okay, before you do that,
yeah.
just some basics for people. I think that there's going to be two sets of people that will ultimately respond to the study. And one is sort of the general population that is not, and it's not all their fault, but all their fault, but not properly equipped to evaluate the quality or credibility of economic analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And my experience over the last 30 years in trying to sort of translate economic literature for a general population is that they've been brainwashed with this mantra dominated by leftist media, leftist Hollywood, leftist academia, that any regulation is worth doing if it quote saves just one life.
Right. No, that's
it's like a religious motto or cult. And so, can you explain the difference between evaluating regulations or their impacts or pandemic interventions based on whether it saves one life or whether it saves one life year?
Right. No, that's such a good question, and I'm actually very excited to answer it. There's different dimensions to it. So basically, most of the literature when it comes to COVID is analyzing the question in terms of what they call the value of the statistical life, which is put around 10 million. Now, the way that is calculated, there's different factors that go into it, but one main factor is basically how much people are willing to pay to save their lives, and that is already kind of disproportionately weighted toward the wealthy and the older. And so it's already kind of a skewed metric. And in addition to that, what it loses is the fact that a person, say, at the age of 85, which is over the average life expectancy generally in the country, person 85 dying is certainly very sad, but it's different in terms of life years than someone, say, 35 years old who dies of a drug overdose, who loses presumably many, many more years of life that he would have had. So this life years criterion really takes into account the fact that, if a young person dies with their whole life ahead of them, that's different from, say, an 85-year-old dying who has, comorbidities and probably not a huge life expectancy left. Now, just to be very clear, that says nothing qualitative that like one life is worth more than the other. It simply reflects the fact that in any public policy analysis, you need to use trade-offs, and that the life years metric of analysis is actually much more fair, because a life year is a life year. It's the same across socioeconomic groups. It's same across age groups, different groups, and so forth. And so using this life year criterion really kind of drives home the true costs of what's going on. Another thing I'd like to say about your point of, oh, they say we need to pay anything to save one life. That gets into a really interesting metric. Now, I'll take an example that actually doesn't have to do with COVID to illustrate part of the point here. And this comes from a real public policy case in the public transportation industry. Now, the policymakers were weighing a decision to impose additional regulations on the airline industry in order to improve safety. Now, that sounds kind of good, for people who really think safety is important. You could say, look, lives simply are worth more than, the economics involved. And so why not impose these regulations? But even looking at this question from a standpoint of lives trump livelihood in every case, you run into some problems. And that is this. The additional regulations, of course, have the downstream effect of higher costs of air travel. And the higher costs of air travel have a deterrent effect, resulting in people who would have taken an airplane taking more dangerous methods of transportation. And therefore, the net effect of the policy, which was originally designed to prioritize life over economics, counterintuitively ends up costing more life years due to the incentives that are put in place by the additional regulations.
Right.
Now, one kind of general point to put out of this is that effects on economy, I guess I've said it many times already, but it's worth repeating, effects on the economy cannot be disaggregated from public health. Now, it's very interesting that you ascribe the kind of general idea that, oh, a life is worth everything no matter what the costs, and forget about the economy to the left. And that's certainly true when it comes to the COVID discussion. But here's a really interesting thing. The whole body of literature that exists establishing this connection between socioeconomic status and public health is, supported in every other context by precisely these leftist people, because it's used to justify welfare programs, job programs, and everything else. This idea that, oh, if they're kind of the clients of the left, if they're out of jobs, this is a public health crisis, precisely because of the established economic literature linking those two things.
Yeah.
So I think it's very interesting that all of these leftist economists, all of these public policy makers, the whole constellation of so-called experts that we unfortunately defer to,
Right,
uniquely suspend this method of analysis when it comes to analyzing these lockdowns.
right.
And that's I think a very damning thing. And again, it's like, have your pick. Is it the greatest criminal act of greatest crime against humanity, or is it the greatest act of criminal incompetence? Either way, it's an absolutely damning condemnation of our ruling elite in this country. And as those very powerful videos that you showed demonstrate, I think, and with all this talk about the threats of foreign countries, threats of everything else, just further underscores this very uncomfortable reality that we all have to face, is that the true enemies, the American people, the true enemies from the West, are the people who run our own countries for the large part. The true enemies of the American people are the people who run America.
That's right. That's right. And we'll delve more into the blame of these institutions. I want to give the sort of the headline that's been getting out there and then flesh that out. The very first introductory sentence of the study article at revolver.news says, a groundbreaking new study commissioned by Revolver News concludes that COVID-19 lockdowns are 10 times more deadly 10 times more deadly than
Right.
the actual COVID-19 virus in terms of years of life lost by American citizens. And noteworthy to people that they'll be able to comprehend is that this fatal, dire, deadly effect was found by the researchers of this study across all age groups, correct?
Right.
Okay.
It was found across all age groups, just in the interest of kind of being granular about it and kind of maybe anticipating some objections to that.
Mhm.
I think part of the reason it's able to have that result is that the highest age group is 55 and up. So it's possible if like there could be an age group of like 80 and up for which that's not true. But I mean, that of course does not undermine the ultimate conclusion analysis. If you have a public policy that is only advantageous in terms of life years for people who are 80, who are already several years over the average life expectancy, that kind of shows that maybe the kinds of trade-offs that are necessary in any sorts of public policy analysis are not really being optimized in that case.
Right. One thing I wanted to note before I forget as well is that there were 3 researchers that were involved in the study. One is a PhD candidate, and 2 of them are PhDs, one in economics and one in social science. And talk about this, they cannot come forward lest they be sanctioned or punished by their universities for putting their names on this study.
Yep.
Why?
Very true. Yeah, very true. I'm in contact with the authors of this piece, and I can say that as every one of your viewers know, there's an extreme crackdown on speech related to the only 2 things that matter in this political moment. Literally, the only 2 things that matter right now. Forget about everything else. Is the lockdowns and the riots. And of course, they're associated with what you can't. They're connected in this kind of grand narrative that we're all seeing unfold before us. This march into a kind of dystopia that none of us could have imagined. But the only 2 things that matter are the lockdowns and the riots. And on both of these questions, speech is being very vigorously repressed. And there are professional repercussions attendant to legitimate, highly credentialed, highly positioned researchers who are in academia who are subject to the loss of grant money and the loss of all kinds of things should they become publicly associated with such a study. So like just the incentive structure that necessitates pseudonymous analysis such as this, the incentive structure itself is damning to not only the culture of the country, but specifically to the policy community as well. I mean, the stakes are just too high to have it so intelligent, highly credentialed people who make an analysis that's open for anybody to critique, for people like this to have to use a pseudonym because they're currently employed in academia. So,
right.
It's just one of those things that gives you a further sense of the dire situation we're in this country.
Yeah, but China.
Right. No, it's one of those things. It's like, it's not like the Chinese are not necessarily great, but before pointing fingers, we got to like really soberly confront where our country is headed. And so far, it really looks pretty bleak. And we really need to, find a way to counteract these trends that we see unfolding.
For sure. And whereof you speak as a, do I call you a recovering academic?
I think I'm almost fully recovered at this point.
For those of you who don't know, of course, Darren was ensconced at Duke University until, when did you leave? When was that?
I left in 2016.
That's right. Well, this redefinition by Silicon Valley of raw, straight data and its analysis as either hate on the one hand or a public health threat on the other
Right.
is a huge
Right.
menace. And I wanted to call up this chart right here and have you comment on it. This is U.S. COVID-19 deaths by age group, charted by the study. And can you explain a little bit more? And I know this is going to be, for some people, it'll make their eyes glaze over, but I'm all about forcing people to do the things they need to do here and understand these kinds of things. But the way that the analysis worked was by using European unemployment studies, correct? And then sort of talk about how that was derived.
Actually, I could get into that specific graph, but I think it would be more helpful simply to say that, of course, because the analysis in factoring, we have to factor in how many life years were saved by the lockdowns. And in order to do that, you have to come up with some estimate as to how many more people would have died across age groups had we not had the lockdowns.
Right.
And because that's a counterfactual, that didn't actually happen. The way that the study does that is they look at a country that actually didn't have the lockdown, and they look at, namely Sweden. And just in case, like if people say, oh, Sweden was a kind of maybe a special case because of various cultural factors, or it doesn't really make sense to simply transplant the death rate in Sweden in no lockdown and assume that would be the case in the United States.
Yeah.
It uses the UK, which began with a no lockdown herd immunity strategy, as a kind of upper bound estimate for those who think that Sweden might be a little bit of a jump to assume that we would have those same numbers.
Right.
I would like to add to that actually the study itself is extremely conservative in many respects. I mentioned one is that it's kind of a big one, that the study, first of all, takes for granted that all of the reported numbers that are COVID deaths are actually COVID deaths. That itself is, I think, subject to critique, but I think the study wanted to leave aside maybe kind of incidental matters which could lead to kind of controversy, simply to focus on the core issue, which is once you use the life years metric, it becomes clear that this is a disastrous policy. And no matter what you do to quibble with the particulars as to the magnitude, there's no way you can massage out an order of magnitude, that is to say a factor of 10 difference in terms of life years lost versus life years saved.
Right.
Another area where the study is actually conservative is that for the people, there aren't very many, but for the people who are young, who are recorded as having died of COVID, it uses the life years lost by weighing that against the average life expectancy. So if somebody, say 30, is represented as having died of COVID and the average life expectancy is, say, 80, it says, okay, that's a 50-year difference. Whereas in reality, the younger people dying of COVID probably have comorbidities, which would lead to a much lower life expectancy and therefore in practice, a much lower loss of life years. If you're, someone who's obese and you have all kinds of health problems such that you die of COVID when you're 30, your life expectancy was probably lower than the average life expectancy, is the point.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And am I looking at the right chart here for
that one's good. That one
Yes.
shows, that one's actually, I think, the most powerful and kind of simple graph.
Yes.
And that basically, very simple. The pink or red, whatever color that is the life years lost.
Mm-hmm.
And the blue is the life years gained, and that's per age group. And you can see that when you get to the older group, there's a little bit of blue, but it's totally outweighed even there by red. That's yes. I think that's graph is just so devastating. I hope people just share it all over the place. Send this stuff to everybody you know.
Yes, and I put the link in the chat rooms for Facebook, YouTube, and Periscope. That is the killer chart right there. Killer, not a pun.
Yep. And
Yeah. Oops. Hold on. Oh, we lost Darren. Hopefully he'll get back here. But I think it's not. I think it's appropriate too that the color of the bars for the life lost is red. And that's super important because really the bottom line here, while I'm waiting for Darren to come back, everybody, is that you have to evaluate the costs as well as the benefits of these interventions. I'm trying to get Darren on back right now. While we wait for him, for those of you who might have joined in a little bit late, I played that atrocious video of the pregnant mom in Melbourne, Australia, who was arrested for communicating on Facebook, on social media, about an anti-lockdown protest that she was trying to organize. She was taken away in handcuffs by the police and cited for, quote, inciting violence. So right now, by merely talking about the junk science that's been involved in these global lockdowns, and by my merely communicating to you what we did last night right here in my home state of Colorado at the Bandimere Speedway, 5,500 people came out, turned out to protest the unconstitutional executive orders and public health orders. We're talking about nearly 200 of them that have been issued by King Jared Polis to decimate our economy, to ruin lives, to smash businesses, and to throttle the civil liberties of Colorado citizens without any public input. If any of you are in comments right now who were at the rally, give me a shout out, and I'm giving you a salute right back to you. I'm sure you saw all of the biased media coverage, undercounting the 5,500 plus people who were there. There was one ninny reporter from 9 News, which I called out in my speech, by the way, and I'll post the speech as soon as I get a good quality video of it for you, who was fretting that those of us who attended the rally were not wearing our masks in our freaking cars. It was ridiculous. Okay, I am done vamping because I see Darren Beatty back with us. Hey, Darren.
I'm back. Sorry about that.
No worries. So we were talking about this chart and the red, which by the way, I also noted that's very appropriate because the lives lost represented here by blood red.
Right. Right. And there's another aspect, and again, it's like it can be taken the wrong way. Any public policy analysis involves trade-offs. So this is not to say that an older person's life is worth less. And in fact, the ironic thing is it's a lot of the older people who understand what a scam this is and are willing to step up and protest against it. And unfortunately, it's a lot of younger people who have been brainwashed by all of the propaganda who support this. So it's kind of a weird thing because the actual policy, and Tucker Carlson mentioned this in his coverage of the studies, that it is in a way like a sacrifice of the young for the very old. But the thing is that the study actually shows that it's a sacrifice across all age groups. So if it's really a sacrifice of everybody except for maybe like people over 80 who are already over the average life expectancy. And it's sad, but death is a part of life. Like everybody dies, nobody has an infinite amount of life years. It's finite. And reminds me of a conversation I had recently with someone who has interesting ideas, but maybe kind of prone to conspiratorial thinking, suggesting that this is a virus that, it's the old China virus thing. This virus comes from China, and it was and I say, well, why would they have this bioweapon that is really so ineffective? Like the bioweapon is our own stupidity and our response to it. It's like why would you generate a bioweapon that only can target very old people? And the response of this person, which I don't agree with it, it's just kind of interesting to illustrate a point, was that China has such a problem in terms of demographics, in terms of their age structure, that maybe they just wanted to even out the age structure and get rid of their very old people, to make the economics work. And which is probably not true. I have no idea, but it's interesting to underscore, like, what we're doing is actually the opposite. Like, you could, like, and the person was, oh, how dare the Chinese, they sacrifice their old old people for the young. But what we're actually doing is the reverse. We're sacrificing young people and their lives and their livelihoods for maybe an extra couple months or whatever for somebody over 80 who's already very sickly. Maybe. And that's with a bunch of assumptions. And so it's just, there's this really weird kind of intergenerational dynamic, which, when layered on top of the fact that it's actually a lot of the old people I've found who understand how disastrous this is, and a lot of the young people who are the most brainwashed and even, supporting a kind of lockdown policy that is facilitating their immiseration and destruction as a generation. And all of this is not even to look at, we're thinking of life years and just to kind of creatively explore. There's so many rabbit holes you can go down to fully explore all of the tragic implications of these lockdowns. One of them is just think of how many people haven't been able to form families, to afford to form families or anything as a result of the lockdowns, as a result of the economic destruction. How many people won't be born who would have been born otherwise? It's actually astonishing once you put your mind in that kind of counterfactual mode of just exploring how many downstream effects are there from these lockdowns. And that's why I say it's so profound that I don't think the average person really wants to comprehend it, because it's so evil, it's so destructive, it's such a great crime, and I think most people just would rather not really face that very ugly reality.
Yeah, some of these effects are talked about more than others, and and it's certainly not because Silicon Valley is facilitating a wide open discussion of these things.
Right.
But I think that there are enough people that are vested in our culture and in institutions in cracking the veil on mental health discussions, that somehow that does kind of get out there. I mean, again, there are sort of institutional and cultural reasons why. I mean, there were plenty of pre-existing pathological conditions that people were worried about with regard to American teens and American youth. But the suicide statistics have been talked about. I talked about it on Sovereign Nation with Alex Berenson. That stuff's getting out there.
That was great. Yeah.
There's one specific pathology, and I don't think we've ever talked about this, but I have personal experience with it because my own daughter, she's not a teenager anymore, she just turned 20, but she had clinical OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And it took an enormous amount of intervention and therapy for her to be able to live her life again.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she was literally locked up in her room, unable to live life. It was, functionally interfering with her life. And the therapy that worked the most is the most controversial and the most ruthless one, which is exposure therapy, exposing yourself to the things you fear most. Mm. And so you can imagine how I felt when this whole thing started. Oh my God, this is going to be a relapse, like, we could imagine. And she has ended up being, one of the most resilient members of our family because of it. And, I can't even imagine the clinical OCD that's been induced now among elementary age school students. The thing that's alarming to me most about it is there are very few practitioners in, the psychiatric and psychological fields who will embrace exposure therapy because, like I said, it's the most ruthlessly effective way of curing people of this. And in so many instances, both American psychiatry and psychology are not interested in actually curing people, right? Making them resume their lives.
Right.
And that's just one small example of it. But I think that what you said and what you said, Tucker pointed out about the punishment generationally that's occurring is beyond anything
it's devastating.
Yeah,
it's really devastating. And there's so many anecdotal cases. Like I could just go, like, it's the thing. It's like, you know, how many, we all must have anecdotal cases. Older friend. Here's the thing. It's like, it's not just this thing protecting old people. Just one anecdotal example. There are a lot of older people who have real ailments that require medical attention, and that they're not getting that attention because they're either scared of going to the doctor of getting COVID, or they're just, it's the various restrictions in terms of travel, all kinds of other ways that it would make it more difficult to do it. But a lot of them are just scared. I know people are just scared to go out in public, and so they're not getting medical attention for actual serious stuff that they have because they're scared of going to the doctor and maybe getting COVID. How many people like that? How many people are not getting medical attention for things that they actually need? Back when they were telling us we need to flatten the curve, nobody could go to the doctor. And of course, far from being flooded into overcapacity, most of the hospitals were in undercapacity. And so how many people died as a result of that? So it's quite amazing. And there are other cases. So it's like you combine the two, is you have a lot of cases. Again, I know concrete anecdotal cases of this, of younger people, because the economy is shot, having to go back and live with their parents.
Yes.
And the parents are so paranoid about COVID that they won't let their kids leave the house because they're worried that they'll come back and give them the COVID. So you have these like people who are young adults that are literally trapped in their parents' house. And I think many people would, we all love our parents, but that can be a disaster. So it's like not being able to leave the house,
Yes.
But, more seriously, there's a huge spike in all kinds of domestic abuse, child abuse, all this kind of stuff. It's all associated with the kind of additional stressors and the perverse incentives that are encouraged by this criminal lockdown.
So much wreckage. And this is a good transition to this fantastic piece. I just linked it on Revolver News. Let's see where it is. Criminal incompetence or worse, America's failed ruling class and our new lockdown dystopia. This gets into the failure of institutions that we referenced earlier. There's a paragraph I want to read here to folks, and I'm also putting the link in all of the chat rooms right now. Just give me a second because I don't have a producer. Right here. Is that the right one? Yes. The catastrophic decisions that were made reflect the reality of who holds power in American society. Politics alone didn't explain what has happened. Our wealthiest citizens are tech oligarchs who had nothing to fear from the market disruption of lockdowns. In fact, they benefited immensely, and I'll let you take it from there. Uh-oh. Okay, we've got Darren frozen. I'm going to read a little bit more of this to you because it's a point that I've also made about the enrichment of Silicon Valley thanks to the pandemic. Let's see, we'll try and get Darren back in here, but he writes, it's written here at a Revolver, as restaurants and physical retail fell apart, tech filled the gap, and the ownership class grew billions of dollars richer. Meanwhile, a larger and larger slice of the American populace has become divorced from ordinary economic reality. The labor force participation rate has never recovered to where it was before the 2008 financial crisis, and about 24 million Americans work for the government at some level, facing far less economic pressure than the private sector. By the way, everybody who's still with me, we're going to be covering the state of the American worker on this weekend's Sovereign Nation on Newsmax. And so this fits right in with this theme of workers being devastated as the oligarchs are enriched. And we've got Darren Beatty back. So I have
Apologize.
This is no worries, the perfect segue right to you about the oligarchs who have profited from the pandemic.
Right. No, it's amazing. So just as like so much of this grand narrative that's been playing out before our eyes, and the grand narrative that really picked up during the last presidential election has been continuing into this point, and I think is going to get even crazier in the coming months. But part of this narrative is exposing the rotting carcass for all to see, exposing the multiple scams within scams that constitute the various kinds of power structures that govern this country.
Yes.
And one of the scams is revealed quite plainly in COVID, which is that, well, the real economy is absolutely devastated. Some people are profiting off of this, and these people include Jeff Bezos, who recently became the first $200 billion man ever. In fact, curiously enough, because real social interaction is so curtailed, people are forced into their homes where their only means of communication is the internet. And the internet is simultaneously being subject to speech crackdowns of the sort that have never existed in this country's history. So you put people in a position where they're not able to organize in person. Facebook will let you organize a Black Lives Matter protest.
That's right.
They will not let you organize a lockdown protest. That's funny how that works.
Yes,
So they curtail people's communication channels, their means of organization. They have quite literally a captive audience. And now they're going through the process of making sure that you have no information that you need in order to confirm your own intuitions about something deeply ominous going on in this country, both with the lockdowns and with the riots. And you have people like the Bezos, other like profiting, and that might be even, that's a very important story, but that might even be a distraction from just how the power structure is really being consolidated at this point at kind of every level. And, we mentioned the kind of censorship that pertains to the Rittenhouse issue and also the COVID issue. So it's associated with, the riots and lockdowns. And one trend that you are, I'm sure, acutely familiar with is that there's been a convergence of justifications for censorship. So there's a whole infrastructure of censorship built out to address hate. And by hate, they mean anyone who criticizes open borders immigration.
That's right.
Anybody who doesn't want to see Chicago looted and people's multi-generational businesses destroyed. Anyone who doesn't like that, they have a category hate for that. But they've built up other categories that they surveil and police with equal, sometimes even more severity. And those new ones that, again, curiously enough, have emerged with an incredible robustness since the election are misinformation,
Yes,
disinformation, and so-called conspiracy theory.
that's right.
Now, and so what you see is basically a convergence of the type of censorship usually reserved for people who criticize stuff like open borders. Now that applies to anyone who dare critique the officially sanctioned narrative on anything.
Yes.
Because that's what misinformation is.
Yes.
Misinformation is anything that does not align with the officially sanctioned narrative at the moment. And so there's been a full-scale convergence that is enabled to sustain an aggressive censorship of anything that goes against the narrative on immigration, anything that goes against the narrative on crime, on riots, anything that goes against the narrative on foreign policy. So the only person on American television who questioned like the Syrian chemical attacks was Tucker Carlson. Other than that, it was all foreign news sources, which are algorithmically demoted on YouTube. And so if Tucker hadn't covered that, you literally would not be able to access information that was ultimately vindicated, that was instrumental to a effective foreign policy analysis when it came to that Syria decision. Yes. And so across the board, people are being deprived of basically the precondition for having a democracy at all. And again, the pretense of the democracy is being destroyed because, again, like look at it quite simply. Democracy is supposedly this system where people, once they reach a certain age of maturity, are able to evaluate information and evidence and make a decision as to who they think is best to lead the country. The presupposition in a democracy is that people have the maturity and capacity to evaluate information and make a political choice. But the assumption behind the censorship is that people don't have that capacity.
Right.
And so the whole pretense of us being a democracy, or the people who control this country thinking it's democracy, has been kind of stripped away. And that's kind of a very dangerous thing, because we're at this kind of intermediate point where we're still kind of grasping on to this illusion that we're a liberal democracy, we're a free country, but we're grasping on it in a much more kind of perfunctory, unserious way, like, kind of maybe, but we all kind of know not, and we know that it's it's going to slip away. And sometimes the ruling class pays a little bit of lip service, but it's almost a type of lip service that reveals their full contempt for the illusion and how much they actually need to exercise it at this point. Because once they have complete roll-up of power, they don't even need this illusion that it's a democracy. They don't need the illusion anymore of trumpeting these fake conservative people out there for controlled opposition. They don't need these fake things anymore once they're able to exercise direct brute power. And I think, unfortunately, we seem to be equilibrating in that direction. I don't think it's over. I think there's still a lot of fight left in the American people. I think there are a lot of very smart young people that could constitute an emerging elite that could supplant this corrupt, utterly dysfunctional, and even evil ruling class that is simply not fit to be a custodian of anything, let alone one of maybe the greatest country ever. So there's the story is yet to be written, but I think we can all kind of sense to varying degrees where the plot is going.
Yes, the dispensing with all of the theater and the kabuki is alarming, and yet I think it's exactly what's been needed. I mean, so you've got the convergence on the Silicon Valley side, but you also have the strange bedfellows now who are awakening, and it's enough numbers now that it makes a difference in the calculus.
Right.
People thought I was crazy a year ago when I said that an alliance between opponents of mass migration and opponents of vaccine mandates was going to happen. And then it happened. People understand that there is no such thing as informed consent when it comes to big pharma's plans for the American citizenry. And we don't have an informed citizenry when it comes to either getting reliable, credible, factual information about the pandemic or about the riots. Mm-hmm. And so when Silicon Valley dispenses with this idea that there are clear rules and that they are applied equally among those who are violators of their community standards, I don't know, it throws all of the dissidents into each other's arms. I mean,
Right.
that's what I mean.
Right. And if I could just interject on that, like,
Yeah.
you know, politics is a very fractious thing, and the political arena tends to attract all kinds of, you know, difficult personalities. But I think one thing that's encouraging is that just as there was a kind of coalescence in 2016, the stakes are so high now. And it's, you know, my attitude is, I don't care what you think about any of these peripheral things. The only thing that matters now is the lockdowns and the riots. That's all that matters. And, you know, people need to recognize that and you know, learn to, you know, pick their battles and prioritize. The only thing that matters now is the lockdowns and the riots. The way that I formulate it is we need to open up the economy and shut down the riots. It's that simple. You open up the economy, shut down the riots. That's the winning message. I'm happy to see Trump moving much more in that direction, and also happy to see a Biden foolishly playing into the hands of it, because he's put himself in a position where he can be credibly cast as the lockdown candidate and the riot candidate. And you know, he even floated the idea of instating lockdowns if scientists tell you, and I was going to say something that was offensive to people in public health, so I won't say it. But it involves, you know, what kind of mind usually, you know, goes and gets a master's degree in public health. This is not, you know, it's not Bertrand Russell doing this stuff when they talk about, you know, doctors and things like that. But so he says if the scientists tell him he's going to do another lockdown. So what's remarkable about that claim is that if he were to win, he would be inaugurated in January. So imagine there being lockdowns in January. I mean, that's totally unacceptable. It's just a non-starter.
Yeah.
And I hope that you know, the president continues to lean into saying, like, look, Donald Trump is the guy who's against the riots and against the lockdowns. So that's the only thing that matters. That's all people care about. And I hear all kinds of stories, like, you know, Minnesota is interesting. You know, Biden couldn't pick Klobuchar because of what happened in Minnesota. But I think there are a lot of people in Minnesota who are going to vote like Alabamans in 2020 because of the kind of destruction that they've seen. And you know, there maybe, you know, no more Mr. Midwest nice guy. I think there could be an element of that, and just a lot of just decent apolitical people. Like, imagine if you're someone in Wisconsin, you have your business burned down. I mean, it's horrible and totally unacceptable. And I think it's something that's, you know, galvanized people across the board in a way that that we haven't seen in a long time.
I hope so. You know, the political landscape in Wisconsin is very fascinating to me, and it probably plays into so much of what you talk about, because that state had been ruled by Paul Ryan Inc.
Right,
for
that's
decades.
Right. I forgot about
and
that.
Reince Priebus, who also came out of Wisconsin.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
We had years and years of Republican rule at the local, state, and federal levels. They did nothing to prevent what happened there, and they're nowhere to be found now. Paul Ryan has a massive nonprofit and also is starting a for-profit hedge fund.
Right.
He's making bank. It's a perfect illustration of what you're talking about.
Right.
And meanwhile, you know, the rank and file of conservative Republicans, businessmen, independent people like the working class car dealership owner, whose $2 million worth of cars were smashed in Kenosha. That's what Kyle Rittenhouse was dispatched to try and protect a 17-year-old.
And just to loop it together, and like I think it's terrible that, you know, there are losses of life. Like, even though I think, you know, Rittenhouse is, justified self-defense. Like anytime, human life is lost, I think it's very sad, even if it's the other side. And I think it was unnecessary, because if these riots had been stopped, all of those lives would have been saved. It's just, but putting aside, those lives being lost, I think we can kind of loop it back to the Corona study, in the sense that the connection between economic devastation of livelihoods and lives, that's not unique to the Corona study. That's across the board. So all this property destruction that you're seeing is the destruction of life. And, you could probably run a similar analysis of how many life years are going to be lost because of the economic devastation of the riots.
Yes.
And so it's not just businesses. It's not just people's dreams. It's not just people's family legacies. It's also people's lives for the same reason.
Yes, absolutely. Perfect note to end on. And so I just want to drill that into all our viewers' heads here, the thousands of people who are tuning in on Facebook, YouTube, and Periscope. You cannot disaggregate the economy from people's lives and the impact on them. Make sure that you share the Revolver study. I put the links in the chat rooms. I'm also going to include it on the YouTube version of this, which is going to go up, as well as the Facebook, permanently as a permanent archive. We hope, knock wood. And then the other 2 points to come away with, the most important 2 things about this election that Darren Beattie wants you to remember and share with your friends as you head into the polls, as you organize in your communities, is that we need to end the riots, shut down the riots, reopen our communities, our churches, and this country. Darren Beattie, it is always a pleasure, and someday we'll play pickleball together.
Indeed.
Right. Practice what we preach.
Indeed.
Take care. Thank you so much. And everybody go and follow Darren at Darren J. Beattie on Twitter. And of course, the indispensable replacement for the Drudge Report, revolver.news. Take care.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.